Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. My name is Ahmed Moor, a non-resident fellow at the foundation. Today is April 1st, and I'm delighted to be here with Josh Paul, who famously resigned from the State Department over what's happening in Palestine, the genocide, and went on to found a new organization called A New Policy. And we're going to be talking about that today. Josh, welcome to the call.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. Good to be with you.
Josh, I want to start just with some background. Can you tell me about you? I mean, I think like lots of people, when I first heard you speak, I was a little bit surprised to, hear you speak with a British or an English accent, and of course, America is big and diverse, and lots of people have different kinds of backgrounds. But in this particular case, I'm eager to learn about yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. I grew up in London, born to an English father and an American mother, and so have been an American citizen since birth, but lived in the UK most of my childhood. And so that's where the accent comes from. I came to the US or to DC for grad school, and essentially have stayed here ever since. I came to study what was then National Security Studies at Georgetown University. Now it's called the Security Studies program. And that led me into my first job in DC, which actually was in a defense lobbyist, which is a great place to start. People think that the American system is a meritocracy, but it's not. It's very much about who you know. And really, the job of a defense lobbyist or any lobbying firm in the system that we have is to build that network, is to know as many folks as you can on the Hill, in the defense sector, in the foreign policy sector, and of course in the corporate world. And so that was really a great jumping off point. And I'm trying to take some of the right lessons from that experience and apply them to the current work that I'm doing alongside Tariq Habash in A New Policy. Since then, I worked a range of other jobs in the US national security sector, in the Pentagon, in the State Department, on the Hill, and of course overseas as well, both in Iraq for a couple of years and also in the West Bank, 2008 to 2009, finally returning to Washington and working in the State Department, in the Bureau of Political and Military Affairs from 2012 until I resigned in October of 2023.
And so, what does a lobbyist do precisely? I mean, I like lots of people understand the idea, but then how does a firm which has hired a lobbyist turn that expense into revenue? What are the practical job responsibilities, and then what does that look like?
So it really depends on the type of lobbying that you are talking about. In the case of a defense lobbyist or a lobbyist for any corporation, there are two main pieces there. First of all, you are trying to protect the regulatory space, or address the regulatory space in which your sector is operating. So what laws are coming down the pike that will make business either easier to conduct or harder to conduct, and then working with Congress to address those. At the same time, particularly when you are in the corporate space, you're also looking at how do you create opportunities for government funding for the work that you are doing or that the companies you are representing are doing. That has become, I think, a bit more difficult in the last decade or so with the general end of earmarks. They're making a bit of a return. But earmarks are the idea that members of Congress can put in a bill, a funding bill, specific set-asides for individual companies or individual programs. And so at the time that I was working in the defense lobbying sector, that was always the main goal, is how do we get Congress to carve out money from, for example, the Defense Department budget for a specific program or project that a company that the organization was representing, would benefit from, would be a part of. In the current context that I'm working, which is policy-oriented lobbying, the goals are a bit different. What you are trying to do is get Congress to support certain legislation that, for example, advances US interests with regards to Israel and Palestine, that prevents us from doing some of the really harmful things that we've been doing in terms of the arms trade, for example, but at the same time is also on the defensive, right? And trying to prevent the passage of certain laws and bills that would crack down on American free speech, for instance. At the core of both of those, though, are the relationships. What you are trying to do is demonstrate to members of Congress that you are credible, that what you are saying can be trusted, is true, and that you are politically effective, that it is not just you coming in with a request, but that you are rallying behind that request some form of political power, whether it is votes in a congressional district or whatever it might be. And that's something that runs across, I think, all of lobbying.
Understood. Oh, wow, I've got a lot of questions here. So you've been on both sides of kind of the arms argument, initially as a lobbyist, and today as somebody who's arguing that arms to Israel should be curtailed because of human rights abuses. And so, how would you have that conversation on either side of that? I mean, I can imagine a lobbyist for Raytheon walks into a congressional office and says, "Hey, look, this is a jobs bonanza, and we've got a responsibility to create jobs in America." You know, and then what's the countervailing argument? How do you parse that?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I would say I've been on three sides of the argument, right? Because I also, for over a decade in the State Department, engaged in these very same issues from the government perspective. Um, so, first of all, let's be clear that when we are talking about the defense sector, most of the profits for US companies don't come from arms exports. The Pentagon budget is so vast that it far outranks any sort of foreign sales that you might imagine. And so that's where the attention of most of these defense companies is. It is very much on the DoD budget, not on the foreign sales piece. That is not to say, of course, that there are not profits, unfortunately, to be made from arms exports. But let's not also overstate the case, particularly when it comes to jobs. The defense sector does generate, and arms exports do generate some jobs for Americans, but not a vast amount in the broader context. And in fact, a lot of the pressure from the defense industry right now is coming to offshore those jobs. Ironically, in this time of America firstism and bringing manufacturing back home, there's a countervailing pressure that actually, I think, very often puts the defense industry at odds with both the administration policy and the interests of workers here in America. So it's not always so cut and dry. I think the important factor here, though, when it comes to arms exports, is not necessarily the impact of defense lobbying, but the impact of foreign policy lobbying and foreign interest lobbying. And that comes from two places. First of all, it comes from partner countries overseas who are keen to buy American weapons. But it also sometimes comes from powerful foreign interest lobbies here at home, right? If we're talking about Israel, for example, lobbies like AIPAC or Christians United for Israel or Democratic Majority for Israel all tend to step in to push some of these arms sales in the Israel context. That's a pretty unique situation. That really aren't equivalent foreign domestic lobbies for other countries, at least not ones that are focused on defense sector, arms exports, that sort of thing. But I think that's where that and the foreign partners themselves are where a lot of the pressure really comes from.
But could there be? I mean, so what's unique about Israel? Could Chile tomorrow establish a network of Chilean expats or cultivate that network and say, hey, we want to facilitate arms exports to this country because it makes sense for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a few things that are unique here. And just to be clear, there are other, foreign interest lobbies in Washington, D.C. The most prominent, or other than the Israel one, is probably the Armenian one, which has a very loud voice and effective voice in Congress. But the US and Armenia don't have anywhere near as deep a relationship, including, of course, on defense cooperation, as the US and Israel do. Nor, of course, does that lobby have the deep pockets that AIPAC has. But it's also a function of, let's be clear, US domestic community interests. And so it's not like a foreign country can just come in and create a lobby. There has to be, I mean, they can hire a lobbyist and register as a foreign agent, But in the case of APAC, what you really see is a domestic community that has come together and certainly is working with and very closely informed by the desires of a foreign country, but that is ultimately driven from within the US, again, by some very deep-pocketed folks, but that is nevertheless reflective of the interests and the specific interests of an American or a set of American communities, be they religious communities or ethnic communities or others. And so, that's I think, part of the difference here.
Right. So now can you reflect on how you interacted with lobbies in your last role at the State Department? So you were at director level in the State Department, and can you describe your job and then again the interaction with lobbies?
Yeah, sure. So my job was to essentially be the bridge between the U.S. Department of State's Political Military Affairs Bureau, which is the part of the U.S. government that conducts what we call our defense diplomacy, which is the overlap between military and foreign policy issues, which includes, of course, U.S. security assistance. That's the money we give to countries around the world to build their security capacity and to buy into the American arms system, and arms transfers, the actual mechanisms for the transfer of arms. And in both of those contexts, that requires a regular day-to-day engagement with Congress, who, of course, not only write the laws, appropriate the funding, the American taxpayer funding that we are spending, but also with whom there is an expansive system of notifications when the State Department either provides the funding to foreign countries or is intending to authorize a major arms transfer. And so my job was to essentially manage that relationship and to keep the system moving as effectively, efficiently as possible, while maintaining the space for congressional review, for sort of free-flowing policy discussion, which is vital. And so in that context, there was a pretty regular engagement with lobbyists that took several forms. Most of it was in the form of, lobbyists for individual US corporations calling up and saying, hey, we are trying to sell X defense article to Y country. It's taking long. Why is Congress getting hung up on this? What do we need to do to make the case for ourselves, et cetera, et cetera. Some of it as well was on that sort of broader regulatory piece that I was talking about. So you have, not so much individual companies, but associations. So for example, AIA, the the Aviation Industry Association of America, National Defense Industry Association, NDIA, and others sort of pressing for regulatory changes or process fixes or that sort of thing. And so,
Would they have your phone number or
oh
was it
yeah,
just
absolutely. Phone
anonymous
number,
email?
email. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Okay. Okay. Right. And so then you decided to ultimately quit when it became clear that the mechanisms for raising legitimate issues about the use of arms were not working in the manner they should have. Can you describe kind of the overall environment and what it was that caused you to begin to quit? And then I would love to learn, second piece of the question about your state of mind. I mean, it's a big decision. It's especially given where you sat. It's a decision that was sure to attract a lot of attention.
Yeah, so I think I would first say that it's been to me quite clear for a long time that the oversight mechanisms and the policy debates when it comes to arms transfers are, to put it mildly, not what they should be. If you go back to the start of the guiding legislation that defines how the process should work, which is the Arms Export Control Act of 1976. If you look at the debates on the floor of the US House of Representatives, the US Senate, at the time that law was being passed, there was an idea of co-determination over arms transfers, essentially, what you might call a dual key approach, in which, because weapons transfers to foreign countries are so sensitive, can have such long-lasting and, in some cases, such negative effects, it's not enough for the executive branch to say, we want to do this, but Congress has to come in with that dual key and turn it at the same time and say, yes, okay. And the mechanism that was created in law for that is something called the Joint Resolution of Disapproval. This is a mechanism through which, after the administration tells Congress it wants to move forward with an arms sale, Congress can actually vote to block that arms sale if it doesn't approve of it. The problem in practice is that doing so requires, overcoming a presidential veto, which requires a two-thirds majority in both houses of Congress. And in the now 49 years since this process was created, Congress has actually never accumulated a two-thirds majority in both houses to block an arms sale, and therefore has never actually prevented an arms sale from moving forward. So the whole idea of co-determination is really not one that has functioned. So that's the first of all the broader context, and the context in which I've been working in for quite some time. While working within the executive branch and with Congress to address concerns on human rights as they have arisen, which they do pretty frequently, right? Because the United States has a defense trade relationship with a range of countries, many of whom do not have sterling human rights records. That said, I think there has always been a difference when it comes to Israel, and that difference has always been a more limited debate, both within Congress and within the executive branch, because of the political sensitivities. With every other country, we have a policy discussion. And yes, at the end of the day, the policy decision might be, well, yes, there are concerns, but this is in our national interest for some reason or other. But because there is a policy debate, there is, even within that decision-making process, the ability to chip away, to hold a lengthy discussion that then results in some sort of step being taken to mitigate the worst possible outcomes. Even prior to 2023, in the case of Israel, that was a much more circumscribed discussion, where it was much harder to make any headway. But certainly after Israel started its assault on Gaza, that space went away entirely. And for me, it was a combination of, first of all, many years of a broken policy when it came to the US-Israel relationship writ large anyway, and the US role in the quote-unquote peace process, the moribund peace process, but particularly a combination of the scale and the scope that was being done with US weapons in Gaza. Right at the time I resigned, there were, this was October 18th, already 3,500 people dead. At that point, all of them due to US weaponry, 2,000-pound bombs in particular, that were being dropped at an unheard of rate on a densely populated urban area. Combined with the complete vanishing of that space for policy discussion, that not only did no one want to have those discussions, hear those concerns, but in fact, the whole process was being flipped on its head, so that directions were coming from the White House, from the Secretary of State, from senior leadership, to move forward on arms transfer approvals as quickly as possible, and not only from them, but also from Congress, where, in my experience, there had always been, even on controversial arms sales, folks reaching out from Congress to say, hey, we have concerns about this, let's slow roll this, let's talk about the policy implications. But in the October 2023 context, those very same people were reaching out to say, why aren't you moving even faster? And so that's what led to my resignation.
And so why were you different? I mean, I'm trying to picture a day in the office. You kind of walk in, you've got a memo or an email or something saying, fast track this transaction, from the Secretary of State or somebody who's working on his behalf. What is the environment in the office like? I mean, are people kind of enthusiastic about these directives? Are they ready to quietly resist? What does that feel like?
So I don't think people are necessarily enthusiastic about these directives. In fact, my experience at the time I resigned, before I walked out the door, I spent my last day there going around to many of the offices that I'd worked with for many years, and explaining why I was resigning. And I was met with almost universal agreement from people that this is wrong, this is harmful to American interests, this is immoral. And so I do think that, people do take their jobs seriously. They do understand the concerns and the consequences. I was fortunate to have been in a position for 11 years as the director of an office where I had some personal financial runway accumulated, where I knew that I could, resign and still pay the bills for a few months. I was also in a role where I was directly involved in these questions, part of the approval chain for these arms transfers, and I think that that made it, more compelling than had I had a more tangential link and been able to make the argument, for example, to myself that if I don't stay, then someone else could come into the role who will, move things even faster. So that wasn't an issue for me because I could see that there was nothing I could do that would be effective. Or to say, well, I might be able to stay here and keep pushing for something important. I think if I was working on humanitarian assistance, that would have been a compelling argument. But again, there was just no space when it came to the arms transfers to have that sort of impact. I also think that there's a philosophical discussion to be had about what is the role of civil servants in American bureaucracy or in any bureaucracy. Is it to be simply a cog in a machine, and your job is to be the best possible, shiniest, most frictionless cog? Or is it that we all go into government wanting to make a difference, and that the reason we are brought into government is because of our expertise and our experience, and that there is some additional value than just being a cog? And that's, I think that the latter is the formula that I subscribe to. But I think for a lot of people, it is, a job, and they're there to be, a shiny cog. And so, and to be clear, I think that there are arguments for both of those, and I don't disrespect either perspective. In fact, I would say, acknowledging that my perspective is you're there to make a difference, you have to recognize that there'll be others who hold that same perspective and are there to make a difference from a different perspective. I think that debate and that discussion is one of the things that makes, because it is a good faith debate and discussion, is one of the things that makes policy making more effective. But I think that, again, it was that shutting down of debate that well, I'm not here just to be a cog, and that's one of the things that made me leave.
Understood. So it's been 18 months now. Have your basic assumptions, the way in which you think about the United States as a democracy, and all the foreign policy mechanisms that attend that democracy, the engaged bureaucracy that you're describing now, for instance, has that changed radically or meaningfully in that period?
In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. I mean, first of all, even before leaving, I was aware that when it came to the question of US military support for Israel, what we were dealing with was a political problem, not a policy problem. And of course, that's the premise which we'll talk about for a new policy and for the work that we are doing to try and shift the politics in order to get at the policy problem. And so that is, I think, much more clear to all of us, because we see that political repression not only within government, but also around the country, across the country, and in many different sectors. But I think that problem set is clear. I also, recognize that shifting US policy is not something that happens quickly or easily, even in the best of circumstances. And we all have a relatively small role to play in that. It is really the accumulation of pressure from across America that results in those sorts of fundamental shifts, and which take time. I do think that we are facing now an increasing challenge when it comes to our democratic system in general. And this is not a challenge that started with the Trump administration, let's be clear. We saw the Biden administration take unprecedented steps to shut down debate about Israel and Palestine. I think, with the Biden administration, the difference was that it was unique almost to that issue set, that they saw a set of, they saw campus movements, they saw rising voices from across the country, and moved to shut down that debate. I think the difference now with the Trump administration is that they are continuing on that line, but they intend to expand that toolkit to a much broader set of American political debate, whether it is Black Lives Matter, whether it is migration, whether it is women's rights, whatever it might be. And I think that there is a democratic backsliding going on in this country, again, which didn't start under Trump, which is being accelerated now, and I think which makes all of these discussions that much harder to have, because you don't only have to win on the basis of the substance, on the basis of the argument you are making, but you also have to do so in an environment where our democratic voices, our voices at the ballot box, are increasingly being drowned out by the role of authoritarians in government and money in politics.
It seems like you've accepted that the landscape, the policymaking landscape, embeds within it lobbying as kind of a trigger for policymaking, as a way of informing policymakers. Is that accurate to say now? I mean, do you think that we're better off with the way things are with lobbying as kind of an essential feature of the system?
So it depends what you mean by lobbying, right? The right of Americans to petition their government is embedded in the US Constitution. And it is important that Americans be able to lobby their government, be able to reach out both to the executive branch and to the legislative branch to express their opinions and, to link that to their voting intentions. That is fundamental to our system. I think what is a problem in our system is the way in which money has come to outweigh very often those votes, that lobbying. And that is a question of campaign finance. This has been particularly accelerated since the Citizens United decision in 2012, which vastly expanded the role of what we call dark money or unattributed spending in the election process. It's interesting, just in the last few days, actually, US Senator Jeanne Shaheen, who is ranking member, the senior Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee now, has introduced a constitutional amendment to overcome Citizens United, because she is aware of the malign consequences of untrackable, untraceable money in our system. And so I think that is a problem. However, in the meantime, that is the system that we have. I am not yet ready to give up on American democracy, but I think that if we're going to be effective within that system, we need to play within it. We need to take advantage of the same opportunities and the same weaknesses within the system as anyone else who wants to have an effective voice on US politics and US policymaking. And so again, that is what a new policy is setting out to do, is to play the system, to play within the system, recognizing that it is a system that needs a lot of overhaul.
Yeah, I accept that, and I think the practical, reasoned argument is a fair one, recognizing that Citizens United has flipped everything upside down, and I'm hopeful that that people can close that spigot, but we'll see if those efforts come to anything. Now, can you describe the mission of a new policy, and I guess can you also situate it within the landscape of organizations that are working in the same space, I guess. And I don't want to describe what the mission is. I'll let you do that.
Sure. So a new policy's mission is ultimately to shift US policy on Israel and Palestine to one that reflects American interests and that is aligned with American values. And our theory of change is that, again, ultimately, this is not a question of policy making. This is a political question. So what we need to do is both shift the broader Overton window across all American communities, American politics, to be able to have these discussions about, is what we're doing in America's interest? Is it in line with American values? Our answer, of course, right now is that very clearly, no, it is not. But at the same time, to engage in the lobbying of the executive branch and of members of Congress, to inform them, to inform their decision-making, to demonstrate to them that there is broad public support for a change, including broad public support within their districts, that this is going to matter at the ballot box. And then separately, to look at the question of campaign finance and how money can be brought to bear, and this is a separate function by law from the lobbying, to address those political economic incentives for candidates for office. So that is what we are doing. In terms of how we fit within what we call the broader ecosystem, I think there are several things. The first is that we are an organization that is focused on American interests and values, We are therefore hopefully an organization that can appeal to a broad swath of Americans. We're not a partisan organization. We don't align particularly with Democrats or Republicans. We believe that there are opportunities on both sides of the aisle to make that appeal, whether it is about sustaining the international rules-based order, or whether it is about asking why our tax dollars are being sent overseas to pay for another country's war machine, or whether it is about what is the impact on our civil rights, our First Amendment rights here at home. So our goal is to appeal to as many Americans as possible. And part of that is to say that we are not here just to represent any particular community in America. We are not an Arab American organization. We are not a Muslim American organization. We are not a Jewish American organization. We are an American organization. A second part, I think, that differentiates us from, as part of the ecosystem is our direct focus. First of all, we are a single issue organization, U.S. policy on Israel-Palestine, with the caveat that that does bleed over into American civil rights, because we need to have the space here in America to discuss these issues if we are going to have that political change. And second, that in addition to being this single issue organization, that we are also an organization that is dedicated to professional lobbying within the system and to the campaign finance piece. We are, I think we are all activists and advocates in our own right, but in our case, activists and advocates very much within the system as it stands. And that is not to say that we do not strongly believe that there is a role for other forms of activism and advocacy. I think on something as immensely important as this and as difficult as this, really you have to have every line of effort activated. But I think that we are filling a gap here that has not to date really existed in the way that it needs to.
Yeah. And so do you have institutional partners, coalition partners who support the work that you do, maybe from a different perspective, but who also kind of push in the same direction today?
Yeah, I mean, we work with, or I should say alongside, a number of other organizations in this space. And, I think it depends, very much on what is the specific issue. I would say it's sort of campaign focused, right? So I think we are, the ecosystem is always talking within itself and trying to understand what is happening and where the next push is. And so, for example, as we speak today, Senator Bernie Sanders is going to be bringing two joint resolutions of disapproval against arms sales, arms transfers to Israel of 2,000-pound bombs and other air-to-ground munitions to the Senate floor in the next couple of days. And so, of course, we are talking to a range of organizations, both those that are sort of addressing more broadly U.S. arms exports, regardless of the country that they are going to, and organizations that are directly focused on the question of Israel-Palestine, to think about how can we encourage as many senators as possible to support those resolutions. On the other hand, if we're talking about the crackdown on civil rights, of course, my co-founder here at A New Policy, Tarek Habash, resigned from the Department of Education, where he worked on policy, has a long background in education policy, and so has a very strong network, again, on the broader American education policy space, as well as in the more direct student civil rights, particularly when it comes to Palestine space. And so what you tend to do is identify who are the partners who are going to be most effective, who are going to fill out that spectrum of pressure for any one campaign, and continue to work with them to do so.
And how's the reception been? I mean, you have these pre-existing relationships with Congress people because of your previous roles as a lobbyist and in the State Department. Obviously you garnered a lot of attention with the resignation. How have people reacted or responded to your outreach for a new policy?
So by and large, I would say positively. It's early days still for us. We launched in October of 2024, so we're about the 6-month mark right now, or coming up to it. I think we have been not only because I have some of those pre-existing relationships on the Hill, but also because of the nature of our messaging, because we are coming in and saying, look, We are not, lobbying on behalf of some foreign interest. We are here to say and to explain to you why what we are doing is not in America's national interest. I think that is a message that has been able to open some important doors. That is not to say that it has opened every door. There are certainly plenty of congressional offices who remain, I think, afraid to meet with us or to speak out. But there have also been plenty of offices who have been willing to engage with us in public, yes, and also in private. And this is where, over the course, even before we launched a new policy, Tariq and I were up on the Hill advocating on these issues, and where we have met with a number of offices, and you'd be surprised by the names of some of those senators or members of the House who, behind closed doors, are willing to have a frank discussion, who are willing to say, what we're doing is wrong, what we are doing, American weapons are being used to commit war crimes, in Gaza. But, you understand I can't say that publicly. And so for a new policy, one of our goals is, again, to shift those political economic incentives so that those members who know that what we are doing is wrong can say it publicly, don't have to be worried about their next election, because they know that we will have their back. In other cases, right, in those doors that will remain closed, the answer is, well, let's see if these members are really representing their constituencies and their constituents. And if they are not, let's look at opportunities where they might be vulnerable in upcoming elections to find someone who actually will speak for their constituencies and will advance American national interests. But I think it's important to note that is not going to be like flicking a switch. That is going to be the process of multiple election cycles for many years to come.
Right. And I guess I should add at this point that FMEP is a 501c3 and new policies a C4. And what does that mean practically, being a C4 organization?
So, the major difference, right, is that C4s are entitled to, allowed to engage in electoral politics in a way that C3s are not. We can get into the weeds of politics, we can do lobbying, we can make endorsements in elections. That's what C4s can do that C3s cannot. The difference, I think it is worth noting, is another difference, right? Is that both are non-profit organizations. C3 donations to a C3 are tax deductible for the person making the donation. Donations to a C4 are not tax deductible in the same way. But I think we need to recognize that at the end of the day, as much as we all love getting our write-offs when it comes to April 15th, there is only so much, and God bless them, but C3 organizations include, of course, not just public education organizations like FMEP, but also humanitarian organizations are mostly C3 charities. And God bless the work that humanitarian organizations have been doing. But I think, again, our theory of change here is that rather than repeating every few years this urgent drive for food, for medicine, for orphanages, we need to get at the root problem. And that is the politics of America. And unfortunately, that is something that it takes a C4 to do. And so what I would say to folks is, first of all, this is the root problem. If you want to stop having to contribute again and again and again to these urgent and terrible humanitarian causes, we need to fix the system. And, that might require that you don't get as much of a tax write-off for your donations, but this is what it requires. And if, the other side, for lack of a better term, can do it, so can we.
Right. No, I appreciate that message. And now 6 months in, as you begin to think about how to grow the organization and new policy to advance its mission, what are the critical junctures ahead? So fundraising is a big one.
Yeah, sure.
Beyond that.
So fundraising is a big one. Of course, we are also working to expand our organizational capacity more broadly to build partnerships, both with other organizations and with, grassroots across the country. An important part of what we need to do to be successful is to build that bridge between grassroots operations, in every state, in every city, and sort of the centralized function of American federal politics, so that when we go into an office on the Hill and say, you need to vote for example, Senator Sanders' joint resolutions of disapproval, it's not just, Josh from a New Policy saying, please do this, I'd really like it if you did. But I'm able to say, and, guess what? There are 37,000 people in your district who are on board with this and who will cast their next vote depending on how you vote. So building that bridge from grassroots, from individual constituencies to the federal level is very important. At the same time, I think we have to recognize that we are currently in the middle of a battle for American democracy, a struggle for our First Amendment rights. And in that context, we also have to build out coalitions so that Palestine and the issue of Palestine is not ignored, as it has been very often, by those who care about other civil rights issues and left out on an island by itself to be sort of cut off and to wither, but is brought into those so that people, and so I think one of the important things we're doing right now is making the argument to other stakeholders in American civil rights and to the broader American public that this is the leading edge of a much bigger attack on our constitutional rights, and Palestine needs to be centered. You can't just wait for them to deal with this and hope they don't get to you, because they are going to get to you once they're done with this. And that's why you need to stand up here. And at the same time, of course, looking ahead to the midterm elections of 2026 and the next, general elections in 2028, and where are the opportunities there to demonstrate the power that we are accumulating, we as a movement are accumulating.
Will you be putting out a slate of candidates that you endorse? Will you be, in other words, endorsing candidates in
Yes.
midterms?
Yeah, we will be endorsing candidates. I will say that, not only endorsing candidates, but of course, through the Political Action Committee part of a New Policy, directly supporting candidates for office. I think that we are already looking very much at, what are the opportunities. I think that this is an important discussion. If you look at the last election cycle, people say, well, AIPAC spent $100 million. I don't think we're going to match anything like that. I don't know that we need to, but I also want people to recognize that those who wanted a change for the better in US policy on Palestine and Israel also spent not inconsiderable amounts, something in the range of $15 to $20 million. And the problem, I think, was that much of this money wasn't properly coordinated. It was sort of sent out scattershot, sometimes to candidates who were going to win with or without that support, sometimes to candidates who, however good they may have been on this issue, really never had a chance of winning. And so what we are trying to do, both with our own efforts and, through broader coordination within the ecosystem, is try and make that spending more strategic and more effective.
Thanks. I mean, we've only got 15 minutes or so left, and you are also an authoritative analyst on foreign policy generally. So I just want to ask, what the hell is going on with Europe?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a broad question, so it depends.
It is a broad question. I mean, specifically, you expected more on Palestine and Israel. You expected more spine, more moral judgments, kind of translating into policy, and there's been none of that. The leadership has been absent. Dramatic reality for the Palestinians. The leadership, European leadership's been absent. And then there's this continued insistence on talk of a two-state solution, which I have my own views on, but eager to get your perspective as well. So what is happening to Europe? I mean, is this continent kind of falling apart? Is there just abysmal leadership? It's just unclear.
I mean, so look, first of all, there's a broader European problem, right? Which is that the European Union, or Europe in general, is a collection of countries, each of which makes their own policy. There isn't so far, a sort of policy unity, at least, beyond something like climate change. I think on the context of Ukraine, you see the first sort of steps towards European unity of decision making. but that hasn't gone far enough, and even there is plenty of dissent and wrangling. So I don't think it's fair necessarily to expect a single European policy when it comes to Israel-Palestine. It would be nice to see, but I think it's also important to point out that there have been some pretty positive highlights, depending which country you're looking at, right? And here we can single out, I think, in particular, Spain, Ireland, Norway, with honorable mention to Belgium, and even France. I mean, the first global leader to call for a ceasefire in Gaza back in, I think it was December of 2023, was France, was the French president. The problem is that, first of all, you have Europe's, if not most powerful, one of the most powerful countries, Germany, which is stuck in, I don't know what to call it other than a malaise and a historically bounded short-sightedness of its own psyche that has made it, the focus for repression of pro-Palestinian speech. I mean, even to an extent, at least so far, worse than that which we see here in America. And you also have, this tension between much of Europe, and here the UK is an example, where however much pressure there might be for a change in policy, there's also a transatlantic desire to tether itself to America and not to get at odds with, the major power within NATO and within the West. Now, as President Trump and his administration sort of, push Europe off, antagonize Europe over things like Greenland, over things like climate change, is Europe going to begin to get its act together more? Maybe, but I think it's difficult to see how that happens for as long as you have these policy disagreements, where you have Germany in one place, individual countries perhaps in other places, and let's be clear, the continent is also struggling with the same push for right-wing populism that we are facing here in America, whether it is in Hungary or Poland or wherever else. So I unfortunately, I would love to see Europe establish itself as a counterweight within the West, because as someone who does believe in, at least theoretically, what Western values are supposed to be, at a time where we see America, divorcing itself from those values entirely on, and particularly when it comes to US policy on Israel and Palestine, I would love to see an organized group within the West take on that leadership. Unfortunately, it just doesn't seem like it's going to be Europe right now. So yeah, I think we're stuck. And then when it comes to the two-state solution, so first let me say that a new policies position is not to endorse any one outcome or the other. We support, and you can see this on our policies on our website, anewpolicy.org. We endorse Palestinian self-determination. Self-determination is a right of all peoples under the UN Charter. By definition, right? Who are we to dictate what form self-determination takes? I think we're also very cognizant that two-state solution has been the official policy of the United States for several decades. And yet, we are in a place now where it is further away from realization than it ever has been. I also think that we are in a place right now with the politics of Israel-Palestine where there are no clear, just and lasting resolutions to this conflict. And I think the best thing we can do right now is to shift the conflict into a place from which solutions can emerge. I don't think there is a, here's your answer, and let's solve this way, but rather there has to be a process to get us to a place from which, feasible solutions can emerge. And of course, we are in a race with the efforts of Prime Minister Netanyahu, Minister Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, and apparently President Donald Trump, in which one of those solutions, unfortunately, is the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, starting with Gaza. So there is a lot to compete with there. But I think that is the race that we are in right now.
I mean, precisely. I can understand, from a kind of a pan-European perspective, and thank you for that, the desire to defer to the senior partner in NATO, the party which is picking up most of the bill and really keeps the alliance alive. Fine. But I've never really understood this little brother mentality, which seems to hobble the entire conversation. This willingness of European leaders, more or less across the board, with the exception of the, three notable countries, four notable countries that you highlighted, to say, well, there's a global leader here, the United States, do or die, and we're going to follow in lockstep. So we've got Trump on the scene today. Does that relationship begin to break? I mean, you've got the Economist coming out and saying, and the Economist has kind of stayed establishment in Britain coming out and saying ethnic cleansing is bad, front page news. Is this an opening? I realize you don't have all the answers here, but I just love your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I think that, you know, most countries are sort of driven by a realpolitik that is focused on their own sort of narrowly circumscribed national interests. I would like to say that Europe certainly understands the importance of international law in a way that the United States does not because of that relative imbalance in power. And you certainly see that, right, in terms of European support, for example, for the International Criminal Court and for other, international legal regimes, which the United States is sort of, happy to stand apart from and if anything, try to undermine. Whereas I think for European countries who are in a relatively weaker position, they understand that this is a system that protects all of us. So, yes, that might be one incentive, although we haven't really seen that in the course of the last year, where on the one hand, you've had, some senior German officials say that, we will abide by the rulings of the ICC. And if, Prime Minister Netanyahu comes here, we are compelled to arrest him or whatever it might be. But you've also had other senior leaders within Germany essentially undermining that and undercutting those sorts of statements. But I think the question of the Trump factor here is important because, having worked for the UK, for example, in a couple of contexts, both, in Iraq, I worked for the US government for a year and a half, and I worked for the UK government for a year and a half. The theory of UK power in many cases is as that little brother. It's you're not going to be able to go in and drive, Western policy on Iraq, but if you can be a voice in the room with the Americans, that's where you gain leverage. That's where you gain your ability to punch above your weight, as the UK would say. And as President Trump takes America into a place where we are not showing any interest or willingness to listen to our coalition partners or even to have coalition partners, then the incentive for joining with America begins to weaken. And I think Europe has to look to itself then to see how it replaces that, how it recoups that ability to punch above its weight if it is not doing so as a function of its relationship with America. And so I think that's where that change may come. But unfortunately, I don't know that Israel-Palestine is going to be on the leading edge of that change. I think it's much more likely to be, things like Ukraine, European defense, maybe issues such as climate change or migration, maybe even Greenland, who knows? But I think ultimately an effect of that shift may be broader European policy on Israel-Palestine. But again, it's a race against some pretty bad things that are happening right now.
Thank you for that, Josh Paul. Thank you for sharing your time and analysis today. And thank you to our listeners for tuning into this episode of Occupied Thoughts. Please make sure to check out the FMEP website, fmep.org, for resources related to this podcast, and we'll link to a new policy website. Again, I'm really grateful to you for the analysis, for the thoughts, and for making the, frankly, really brave decision to take a moral stance in a time of crisis, really. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for having me, and thank you to FMEP for all the outstanding work they do on educating Americans about our laws and our policy making that are going on in this space. Really appreciate it.